They don't want Bitcoin, they don't care about Ethereum, and they're definitely not watching the rest of the market the way you think they are. Because right now, something very unusual is happening behind the scenes, and it's all pointing toward one asset, and that asset is XRP. While retail investors are still distracted by short term price movements and hype cycles, institutions are quietly positioning themselves in a way that suggests a much bigger plan is unfolding. And if you're not paying attention to this shift, you could completely miss what might be one of the most important setups in the crypto market right now. Right now, the biggest mistake most people are making is assuming that the crypto market is moving randomly, because that belief is not only wrong, it's dangerous if you're trying to position yourself early. Markets at this level, especially when institutional money is involved, do not move randomly. They move with intent, structure, and timing. And if you look closely at what's happening, XRP is starting to stand out in a way that cannot be ignored anymore. While the majority of traders are jumping from one trending coin to another, chasing quick profits and reacting emotionally to every small price movement, there is a completely different game being played at a higher level, and that game is focused on long-term positioning, liquidity control, and strategic accumulation. If you step back and remove the noise for a moment, you start to notice a pattern that most people are missing because XRP is not behaving like the rest of the market. And that difference is not accidental. There's a reason why certain assets stay relatively quiet while others pump aggressively. And it usually comes down to who is accumulating and how they want the market to react. When institutions are building positions, they don't want attention, they don't want hype, and they definitely don't want retail investors jumping in too early because that would push the price up before they are fully positioned. So, what do they do instead? They allow the market to stay boring. They let people lose interest and they quietly build their positions while everyone else is distracted somewhere else. This is exactly where things start to get interesting with XRP, because despite all the noise in the crypto space, despite all the trending narratives around other coins, XRP continues to hold its ground in a way that suggests strength rather than weakness. Most people look at sideways movement and assume nothing is happening, but experienced investors understand that sideways movement often means accumulation, and accumulation is where real money is made, not during the hype phase when everyone is already talking about it. The reality is simple but uncomfortable. By the time XRP becomes the main headline across the entire crypto space, the biggest opportunity will already be gone, and those who were waiting for confirmation will be left chasing the price instead of leading it. Another thing you need to understand is that XRP is not just another cryptocurrency competing for attention, it is positioned differently in terms of its use case, its partnerships, and its long term vision. And that difference is starting to matter more as the market evolves. While many projects rely purely on speculation and community hype, XRP is tied to a much larger narrative involving cross border payments, financial infrastructure, and institutional adoption. And whether you agree with that narrative or not, you cannot ignore the fact that it puts XRP in a completely different category compared to most other assets in the market. This is why the behavior of XRP often does not align with the rest of the crypto market, because it is not driven by the same forces. Now, here's where most people get it wrong. They expect XRP to move like a typical altcoin. They expect sudden explosive pumps without understanding the context. And when that doesn't happen immediately, they lose patience and move on to something else. That mindset is exactly what keeps retail investors stuck in a cycle of buying high and selling low, because they are constantly reacting instead of anticipating. The truth is, assets that are being positioned for larger roles in the financial system do not always move in obvious ways, especially during the early stages of accumulation and development. If you connect all these points together, the picture becomes much clearer because what we are seeing right now is not a lack of movement, it's a setup. And setups are where the biggest opportunities are created. XRP holding steady while the rest of the market rotates through different narratives is not a coincidence, it's a signal. And whether you choose to pay attention to that signal or ignore it will ultimately determine how you position yourself in the coming months. Now, here's where you need to stop thinking like a typical retail investor. Because if you keep looking at XRP through the same lens as every other altcoin, you're going to keep misreading what's actually happening. The market doesn't reward people who react late, it rewards people who understand positioning before the move becomes obvious. And right now, XRP is sitting in a position that most people are completely underestimating. This is not about hype. This is not about daily price candles. This is about understanding how capital flows before it shows up on the chart. If you look at how money moves in cycles, you'll notice something very important that most people ignore, because liquidity doesn't just appear out of nowhere, it rotates. And when it rotates, it follows structure. Bitcoin usually moves first, then Ethereum gains attention. And after that, the altcoin market starts to heat up. But within that cycle, there are always specific assets that get targeted for much larger moves. And those moves are not random. They are driven by positioning, narrative strength, and most importantly, by the players who have enough capital to actually move the market. This is where XRP becomes very difficult to ignore, because while retail traders are busy chasing short term trends, there is a growing indication that larger players are preparing for something that hasn't fully played out yet. You can see it in the way XRP maintains key levels even when the market shows weakness. You can see it in the way it doesn't overreact to hype cycles. And you can definitely see it in the way it stays relevant in conversations that go far beyond typical crypto speculation. This is not normal behavior for a random altcoin. And if you're still treating it like one, you're already behind. Another uncomfortable truth that most people don't want to accept is that markets are designed to shake out weak hands before major moves happen. This is not a theory. This is how every major financial market operates. Because if everyone is positioned correctly too early, there's no one left to buy higher. And without new buyers, price cannot sustain an upward move. So, what happens instead? The market creates doubt, it creates frustration, and it creates the illusion that nothing is happening. And during that phase, most people give up. They sell too early, they move to something else, and they miss the move they were originally waiting for. If you apply that understanding to XRP, the current situation starts to make a lot more sense, because what looks like slow movement on the surface can actually be a controlled environment where accumulation is taking place. This is the phase where patience matters more than anything else, but patience is exactly what most retail investors don't have. They want instant results, they want quick profits, and when they don't get that, they assume the opportunity's gone, when in reality, it hasn't even started yet. There's also another layer to this that most people are ignoring, and that's the narrative shift that's slowly building in the background. Markets don't just move on technicals, they move on stories. And the strongest moves happen when narrative and capital align at the same time. XRP has been surrounded by controversy, regulation discussions, and long term speculation for years. And while many people see that as a negative, smart money sees it as a setup. Because once uncertainty starts to clear, once narratives start to shift from doubt to acceptance, the repricing can happen very fast. And those who were waiting for perfect clarity will once again be too late. Now, think about this logically. If large players are looking for an asset that has already built awareness, already survived major challenges, and still holds a strong position in the market, XRP fits that profile better than most. It has history, it has attention, and most importantly, it has a community that refuses to disappear even during long periods of stagnation. That combination is not something you see in every project, and it's exactly the kind of foundation that can support a much larger move when the conditions are right. But here's the part you need to be honest about. Just because something has potential doesn't mean it will move on your timeline. This is where most people fail because they try to force the market to match their expectations instead of adapting to what the market is actually doing. If you're expecting XRP to suddenly explode overnight without any buildup, you're setting yourself up for disappointment, and that disappointment will push you into bad decisions. The real opportunity comes from understanding the buildup phase, recognizing the signals, and positioning yourself before the majority even realizes what's happening. When you combine all of this, the idea that they only want XRP starts to make more sense, not because it's a simple statement, but because it reflects a deeper shift in focus that is not yet obvious to everyone. And the reality is simple. By the time it becomes obvious, the easy opportunity will already be gone, and what's left will be chasing momentum instead of building position. At this stage, you need to understand something most people refuse to accept because it goes against their emotions, not logic. Markets don't move because everyone agrees. They move because positioning is uneven. And right now, XRP sits in a space where expectations are completely split between doubt and conviction. That kind of environment is exactly what creates explosive moves later, but only for those who understand what is happening before confirmation shows up on the surface. If you observe XRP closely over time, you will notice that it often spends long periods moving in a narrow range. And during those periods, most people assume it is dead or stuck. But experienced participants see something completely different. They see time being used as a tool, not as a delay. Because in real market behavior, time itself is part of the setup. The longer an asset consolidates under controlled conditions, the more pressure builds beneath it. And when that pressure finally releases, the move is not gradual, it is sudden and aggressive. Now, what makes XRP different in this current cycle is not just its price behavior, but the environment around it. There is growing attention from institutions, increasing discussion in financial circles, and continued relevance in cross border payment narratives. Even when retail interest fades temporarily, XRP doesn't disappear from institutional conversations, and that alone is something most other assets cannot claim. This creates a hidden layer of support that retail traders often underestimate because they only focus on visible price action, not underlying interest. Another key point you need to understand is that accumulation phases are designed to feel uncomfortable. If it felt easy, everyone would do it. And if everyone did it, there would be no advantage. That is why during accumulation, the market often creates confusion. One week, it looks like strength. The next week, it looks like weakness. And this back and forth movement is not random at all. It is a psychological mechanism designed to separate those who can hold conviction from those who need constant confirmation. XRP has shown this behavior repeatedly, and that pattern is still visible now. But here's where most people misjudge the situation. They assume that because nothing dramatic is happening, nothing is happening at all. That is a serious mistake. In reality, the most important phases of any major market move happen when almost no one is paying attention. The big moves you see on charts are only the visible result of decisions made long before price reacts. By the time retail traders see a breakout, the positioning behind it is already complete. If you connect this to XRP, you start to see why patience is not just advice, it is a requirement. The market is not designed to reward impatience, it is designed to reward timing and understanding. And timing does not mean guessing the exact day something moves. It means recognizing when conditions are quietly building in the background. Right now, XRP is sitting in that kind of environment where clarity is not immediate, but structure is slowly forming. Another angle that people often ignore is how sentiment shifts over time. When sentiment is negative or uncertain, it creates hesitation. When sentiment is too positive, it creates overconfidence. But the most powerful moves happen in between those extremes when sentiment is unclear, but structure is improving. That is the phase where XRP currently finds itself. It is not fully embraced and it is not fully rejected either, which is exactly what makes it sensitive to future momentum shifts. You also have to consider that markets don't need universal agreement to move higher. In fact, they often move higher precisely because agreement is missing. When everyone is aligned too early, there is no fuel left for continuation. But when opinions are divided, every new shift in sentiment can trigger strong reactions. XRP is currently sitting in that type of divided environment where belief and doubt are both active at the same time. So when people say things like nothing is happening, they are usually looking at the wrong layer of the market. They are focused on immediate movement instead of structural positioning. And that is exactly where opportunities are created. Because the real question is not whether XRP is moving today. The real question is whether positioning is changing beneath the surface in a way that will matter later. And if you are honest about what the chart is showing, combined with how the narrative is evolving, you start to see why attention is slowly concentrating again, not in a loud or obvious way, but in a quiet and consistent way that often comes before major shifts. At this point, the real mistake most people make is trying to predict the exact moment XRP will move instead of understanding what conditions must exist before a real move can even sustain itself. That approach always fails because markets don't reward precision guesses, they reward positioning during uncertainty. If you zoom out and remove emotional bias, you'll notice that XRP is not behaving like an asset that is finished. It is behaving like an asset that is still being prepared for something larger. One of the clearest signs in any market is how an asset reacts when broader conditions change. When Bitcoin becomes volatile, many altcoins collapse under pressure, but XRP often shows a different type of behavior during certain phases where it neither collapses aggressively nor explodes immediately. Instead, it stabilizes in a controlled range. That type of behavior is important because it suggests that strong hands are active in the background, absorbing supply rather than letting it freely move through panic or hype cycles. Now, you have to be careful here because stability does not automatically mean bullish outcome, but it does mean control. And control is what separates random assets from strategically positioned ones. When an asset is under control, it means large participants are comfortable with current pricing levels and they are not interested in letting the market move freely in either direction until their conditions are met. That is very different from chaotic assets that spike and crash without structure. Another thing you need to understand is that XRP's narrative is not built on short term hype. It is built on long term financial infrastructure discussions, which naturally move slower but carry heavier implications. This is why XRP often feels quiet, even when something is developing underneath. Infrastructure level assets do not react like meme driven assets. They evolve through stages, and each stage takes time to reflect in price behavior. This is also where most retail participants lose patience. They expect movement to confirm conviction, but in reality, conviction should come before movement. If you only believe something is strong after it already moves, you are always late by definition. That is why experienced participants focus more on structure than on excitement. Structure tells you where pressure is building, excitement tells you where attention already arrived. Right now, XRP is sitting in a phase where structure is more important than sentiment. You can see repeated levels being respected, you can see reactions becoming more defined, and you can see that the market is not fully breaking down despite periods of weakness. These are not random observations. They are signals that the market is in a transitional phase where one direction is slowly gaining control while the other is losing momentum. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid: transitions take time, and during that time, boredom is the dominant feeling. That boredom is not a flaw in the market, it is a feature. It is designed to filter out participants who cannot handle uncertainty. If every phase felt exciting, there would be no advantage for anyone. The real edge exists in periods where nothing obvious is happening, but everything important is being prepared. If you apply this mindset to XRP, you stop asking, when will it pump, and start asking, what conditions are being built right now that will matter later. That shift alone changes how you interpret everything. Instead of reacting to every small movement, you start observing how the market behaves around key areas, how liquidity is being absorbed, and how sentiment evolves without major price expansion. Another layer that cannot be ignored is the role of market cycles. Every major asset in crypto has gone through phases of disbelief, accumulation, expansion, and distribution. XRP is no exception. The question is not whether cycles exist, the question is which phase is currently active. And based on current behavior, it is much closer to a preparation phase than a full expansion phase. Now, if you combine all of this together, you start to see why attention is slowly but steadily concentrating again, not because of sudden hype, but because of repeated behavior patterns that experienced participants recognize over time. The market doesn't announce transitions loudly, it reveals them gradually through structure. And XRP is currently speaking more through structure than through price movement. And that is exactly why those who are only watching headlines will miss it, while those who are watching behavior will see it forming long before it becomes obvious. Now we reach the most important part of this entire breakdown, because everything up to this point only matters if you understand what it means going forward, not just what it explains about the past. At this stage, the real focus should not be on excitement or speculation, but on clarity. Because when markets reach this type of positioning phase, confusion is not accidental. It is part of the process that separates those who act early from those who wait for confirmation. One of the strongest signals in any asset is when attention slowly returns after a long period of silence. Not sudden viral hype, not random spikes, but a gradual return of discussion, analysis, and positioning interest. That is what typically happens before major expansion phases begin. XRP has been through multiple cycles where interest faded, then slowly returned. And each time the pattern followed a similar structure: long consolidation, growing uncertainty, then sudden revaluation once conditions aligned. But here's the truth most people struggle with. Even if all the signals are present, timing still cannot be perfectly controlled. The market does not move on anyone's schedule. That is why so many traders fail even when they correctly identify assets with long term potential. They are right about direction, but wrong about patience. And in markets like this, being early but impatient is almost the same as being wrong. If you look at XRP's broader position in the market, you have to accept that it is not just being treated like a short term speculative asset. It carries a different type of expectation in certain financial discussions, and that expectation creates a longer runway for potential movement. However, longer runway does not mean immediate reaction. It means extended preparation phases where the market slowly builds the foundation for future volatility. This is where discipline becomes more important than prediction. Because no matter how strong the setup looks, emotional trading destroys more opportunities than bad analysis ever does. People see slow movement and assume weakness, they see sideways structure and assume failure. But in reality, those are often the exact conditions where major moves are born. The market rarely rewards those who constantly chase action. It rewards those who understand when not to act. Another critical point you need to understand is that narratives evolve slowly but reprice quickly. For a long time, XRP has been surrounded by uncertainty, debate, and strong opinions on both sides. But markets don't care about opinions, they care about resolution. Once uncertainty begins to fade, even partially, it can trigger fast repositioning from participants who were previously waiting on the sidelines. That is often where acceleration begins. However, and this is important, none of this guarantees direction or outcome. Markets are probabilistic, not certain. Even strong setups can fail if broader conditions shift unexpectedly. That is why risk management is always more important than conviction. You can be early, you can be right about structure, but if you are overexposed, the market will punish that regardless of your analysis. So the smarter approach is not to try and predict exact moves, but to understand where attention is building, where structure is tightening, and where emotional fatigue is increasing. Those three elements together often define the zones where future volatility is born. XRP currently sits in a phase where all three are present to some degree, but not yet fully resolved. Now, stepping back from everything, the key takeaway is simple. The market is not showing you a finished story, it is showing you a developing structure. And in developing structures, patience is not optional, it is the edge. Those who constantly rotate based on emotion will continue to miss larger moves, while those who understand positioning cycles will recognize opportunity long before it becomes obvious. Financial disclaimer: this content is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. The cryptocurrency market is highly volatile and involves significant risk, including the possible loss of capital. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. Nothing in this script guarantees any outcome or profit. If you are investing or trading, make sure you understand the risks involved and consult with a qualified financial advisor if needed.